Hi YouTube, Darth here. I'm a little bit late this week, but the CTE goes on. It was a pretty typical week in the CTE as we got some long-desired changes and some interesting tweaks. First up, DICE fixed a bug with the revive system in Battlefield, one that's been around since at least Battlefield 3. And that's if there was a kit in the way of your intended revive target, it could block the target from ever receiving the defibrillator revive. On the CTE, this issue was fixed this week, so revive to your heart's content. A change that I definitely find agreeable is that as a soldier, you can now fall and shoot at the same time. So, as an example, if you're falling from a small height in Battlefield 4, on live you would be unable to shoot. However, in the CTE, you can now hit enemies on your way down from that ledge, box, or whatever you happen to be on. Keep in mind that this doesn't mean you can jump and shoot at the same time. Another change that I think most players will welcome is that movement in the Battlefield 4 CTE now mimics the acceleration and movement of Battlefield 3. The developers thought that this was a good blend of both the intentions of the developers with Battlefield 4 and it still allowed players to dive behind cover when it was necessary. So if you like Battlefield 3's soldier movement, you've got a pretty close approximation now on the CTE. If you haven't seen it already, I'm sure you will, but one of the problems on Dragon's Teeth maps and Pearl Market in particular is that clever players can get on the rooftops that are otherwise unreachable. DICE has responded to this on the CTE by adding out-of-bounds volumes to these rooftops. Clearly, there is some more work that is needed. DICE also fixed the mobile AA not spawning for the easternmost team on Rogue Transmission. So the good news is that the map is no longer slightly imbalanced toward the western team. The bad news is that pilots are now going to have to deal with the AA more frequently on the map. Additional work also went into problematic destructible buildings, and they have fixed up some additional object collision. This week, all new hit indicators have come to the CTE. Now, depending on where you hit the target, your indicator will change to show the type of the hit. Chest shots keep the normal hit indicator from vanilla, while limb shots are smaller and headshots are shown in bold. This should help players have a better grasp of when they're landing good shots and not so good shots. A personal gripe of mine since the launch of Battlefield 4 is just how quiet enemy footsteps were. In games with more than a handful of people, you'd never hear them. DICE has heard these complaints and has implemented a change to footsteps to hopefully make the enemy footsteps stand out. They've changed friendly footsteps to be quieter than enemy footsteps, and they've decreased the impact of weapons fire and explosions on the ability to hear footsteps. The net result is that you should be able to hear your enemies coming a lot better than before. Sorry tag collectors, you're going to have to work just a bit harder in the future. If you've been looking for ways to get better control per scope range class, DICE has given you just that. This week, the CTE added support to change aiming sensitivity per scope range class. So, for example, you can have specific sensitivities set for the red dot sights, the 1x hollows, the 3-4x scopes, and so on. This is great news for anybody that uses aim down sight beyond 1x frequently and should be a pretty big boost to the versatility of these longer range scopes. Another change this week was a pretty big hit to the M2 slam mines. On live, they do a maximum of 35 damage, while on the CTE, they now only do 25 damage. Because engineers can only carry 3 without late-tier squad upgrades, this means that a full load of slams are not going to be enough to kill a vehicle any longer. The idea behind this change was encouraging players to use the AT mine, which doesn't see a lot of action because the slam tends to be the best choice in all situations. I'm not a really big fan of this change, as I think it would have been a better option to increase the lethality of the AT mine while decreasing the number carried. I'd rather carry one mine if it had an increased chance of a kill, kind of like a claymore for tanks. If the M2 slam must absolutely be nerfed, I think I'd prefer a change to how quickly damage falls off as opposed to the top end damage nerf. As is, it just kills the offensive uses for the slam. Continued weapon changes were put into the CTE this week, and the targets this time around were the MP7, the FAMAS, and the CZ-3A1. From what I've heard, the maximum fire rates of these weapons were revised downwards. I'm not sure how I feel about this since they weren't staple weapons of mine. However, the community sentiment seems to be against changing the unique feel of these weapons. Personally, I'd have to have played with them more beforehand to have a feeling either way on the change. If they are your go-to weapons and you're on the CTE, be sure to try out these weapons and give DICE feedback in the forums. In another weapon change this week, DICE increased the velocity of the MBT LAW. They also increased the range and angle at which it acquires its target. So now the weapon travels much faster and locks on at a further distance. Before, you had to get the LAW pretty close to your intended target for it to lock on. Now you can use it as a sort of long-range tank sniping weapon. It doesn't do much damage at only 21 per hit, but it definitely brings its own personality to the battlefield now. I feel like it's definitely a weapon that's better suited for maps where its long-range potential can come into play, and I think the new change makes it an interesting alternative to the SRAW. And one last weapon change. The turning radius on the missiles fired from the Stinger and the Igla have been decreased. Now pilots executing extreme turns might just outturn the missile in some circumstances. About the only substantial change you'll see from this is that some missiles fired at extreme angles aren't going to land on their targets, and clever pilots might be able to get past a missile entirely. Just with every week, there were some minor fixes. This week saw additional tweaks to the ready state screen, Paracel storm optimizations, more UI transparency options, players can now change the keybind on Gadget 1, weapon animation fixes, including a fix which reduced the reload time on the RPK 74 by 0.3 seconds, and alterations to goal mode lockers and Zavad to better support Obliteration Competitive. That's it for this week in the CTE. My apologies again for being a bit later on this episode than I wanted, but real life is what it is. Since I missed yesterday's Over Your Shoulder, I'll have a makeup episode for you sometime this week, in addition to the normal episode on Saturday. As always, if you liked this video, please leave a like before you go. If you're new around here, check out my channel and please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching YouTube, and I'll see you next time.